Many imagine the life of an Old West outlaw as a series of thrilling bank heists and dramatic saloon shootouts. In actual fact, the existence was considerably more severe. Outlaws endured a hunted existence, perpetually nomadic, forever vigilant, and meeting swift, grim ends that would curdle the blood. There were no havens, no fallback strategies, and no compassion from the authorities or their fellow criminals. Dare to contemplate surviving when everyone sought your demise or capture? Let us delve into the unvarnished reality of an outlaw's life. The moment you embraced the outlaw life, your primary adversary wasn't the law, but your own confederates. Mutual trust evaporated when desperation, armament, and a willingness to kill for a larger share of the spoils, or a reduced sentence, permeated the group. Outlaw gangs were not fraternal groups. They were fleeting unions of brutal men who would betray each other the instant an advantage presented itself. Jesse James met his demise at the hands of a gang member seeking reward money. Billy the Kid frequently witnessed his associate's treachery. Loyalty endured precisely as long as the financial incentives persisted. Hollywood consistently overlooks this reality. Most outlaws literally slept with one eye open. You'd position yourself to observe everyone in the encampment, your firearm tucked beneath your blanket, hand gripping the butt, because the same individual who rode alongside you during the day might decide that evening that a $10,000 bounty outweighed your companionship. Gang hierarchies were savage and continuously in flux. Leadership was maintained through brute force and intimidation. A single display of vulnerability invited challenges. Losing such a confrontation meant either death or expulsion, leaving you to fend for yourself. Outlaw leaders had no provision for retirement. The division of plunder precipitated more fatalities than lawmen ever inflicted. Following a robbery, tensions inevitably escalated. Everyone felt entitled to a greater portion. Disputes frequently devolved into gunfights, and gangs that successfully plundered a bank often found their numbers halved within a week due to internal conflict over the loot. The most cunning and long-lived outlaws never divulged their true identities. They adopted aliases, fabricated their pasts, and guarded personal details assiduously, because any scrap of information could be exploited once someone decided to claim a reward. New recruits posed the greatest danger. Was this individual genuinely an outlaw, or a Pinkerton detective infiltrating the gang? Outlaws tested new members by compelling them to commit crimes, thereby confirming they weren't law enforcement. Yet, even this didn't guarantee allegiance. Speaking of extreme caution, slumber became a nightmare when you knew posses were relentless in their pursuit and could strike at any moment. Outlaws couldn't simply check into lodgings under their actual names. They required concealed locations that offered anonymity while allowing for swift departures. This typically entailed inhabiting conditions that would break most individuals within days. Cave hideouts were prevalent, but miserable, cold, damp, dark, and often shared with bats, snakes, and other creatures. However, caves provided concealment and multiple escape routes if chosen judiciously. Outlaws meticulously explored caves, memorizing every passage and exit. The key was never to sleep in the same location twice. Predictable routines led to capture. Norman meticulously observed outlaw behaviors, anticipated their movements, and set ambushes. Astute outlaws rotated between various hideouts, never lingering long enough to be tracked. Remote canyons and natural enclosed valleys offered natural fortifications. A single entry point meant visibility of anyone approaching, but also a solitary exit, which could become a death trap if a posse blocked it. Outlaws constantly had to balance defensive advantages with escape possibilities. Deserted structures and abandoned mines offered temporary shelter, but were obvious hiding places. Lawmen investigated these first. Outlaws used them only briefly, always with sentries posted and horses saddled for immediate flight. Here's the truth that mentally crushed most outlaws. Genuine sleep was unattainable. Every sound could signal an approaching posse. Every snapping twig might indicate someone stealthily approaching to kill you. Outlaws suffered from severe sleep deprivation, leading to errors, paranoia, and ultimately capture or death. The truly desperate slept in shifts, with gang members rotating watch duty. But this only worked if you trusted your companions, which, as established, was ill-advised. Many outlaws perished in their sleep, slain by the very person entrusted with guarding against danger. Adverse weather exacerbated every difficulty. Rain transformed hideouts into frigid mud pits. Summer heat rendered caves intolerable. Winter snows left discernible tracks that led posses directly to their location. Outlaws couldn't opt for comfortable camping sites. They chose locations where survival until dawn was merely a possibility. And this was just the beginning. Securing sustenance without being observed or apprehended demanded skills far beyond ordinary hunting. Outlaws couldn't simply enter a town and purchase provisions. Their faces adorned wanted posters, and recognition meant suddenly facing a dozen armed citizens eager to claim reward money. Consequently, outlaws had to acquire food through methods that ensured their secrecy and survival. Raiding remote farms and ranches at night was the primary approach. They would target a location after dark, taking chickens, vegetables, and perhaps a pig if they could do so quietly. The objective was to steal from places far from settlements, where the theft wouldn't be reported swiftly. By the time the farmer discovered the loss, the outlaws would be 50 miles away. However, farmers protected their property with dogs, firearms, and sometimes hired hands who slept in the barn. Outlaws attempting to steal food frequently found themselves in gunfights that drew law enforcement. Many wanted men died endeavoring to steal a single chicken. Hunting was feasible, but perilous. Gunshots resonated for miles, attracting unwanted attention. Outlaws had to hunt far from their hideouts, using single shots to conserve ammunition and minimize noise. They also hunted at dawn or dusk, when distant sounds were more common and less suspicious. Fishing proved more effective due to its silence. Outlaws would employ lines and traps in secluded streams, checking them at night. Fish provided protein without the risks associated with hunting or stealing. However, this necessitated being near water, which restricted potential hiding places. Foraging for edible plants kept outlaws alive between successful robberies. Wild onions, berries, nuts, and roots supplemented stolen and hunted food. The drawback was that extensive foraging left traces of human presence that trackers could follow. Some outlaws maintained connections in remote areas, sympathetic ranchers or farmers who would discreetly sell supplies, no questions asked. However, these relationships were fraught with danger. A single word to the authorities, and that seemingly friendly supplier became the instrument of your demise. Preserved foods were highly prized. After a profitable robbery, shrewd outlaws would purchase or steal dried beans, flour, coffee, and salt. These staples lasted for months and could be concealed in various locations. Outlaws would cache supplies in multiple spots, creating emergency reserves they could access during desperate times. Truly desperate periods meant consuming items that would cause illness. Rotten meat, spoiled vegetables, anything providing calories. Starvation was a constant threat for outlaws on the run. Many surrendered simply because they were on the verge of starving to death. When circumstances worsened, treating injuries without medical professionals meant that most wounds that would be minor today became death sentences. Outlaws constantly suffered from gunshot wounds, stabbings, beatings, and other injuries. However, they couldn't simply visit a doctor. Medical practitioners were legally obligated to report gunshot wounds to authorities. Entering a doctor's office meant entering a jail cell. Bullet wounds were the most frequent injury. If the bullet passed through without striking bone or major organs, survival was possible. Outlaws would pour whiskey on the wound for sterilization, pack it with cloth, and hope infection didn't set in. More often than not, infection prevailed. Removing bullets required crude surgery performed by gang members without medical training. They would heat a knife over a fire, incise the wound, probe for the bullet, and extract it. There was no anesthesia except whiskey. The pain was excruciating, and the risk of infection was virtually certain. Here's what typically killed outlaws who survived the initial shooting. Gangrene. When infection took hold in a wound, the flesh would putrefy, turn black, and spread. The sole treatment was amputation, which outlaws performed on each other using saws and knives. Most died from shock or blood loss during these amateur surgeries. Broken bones healed incorrectly or not at all. Outlaws would set breaks themselves using splints fashioned from branches. But without proper medical care, bones healed crookedly, leaving men permanently disabled. A broken leg frequently signaled the end of an outlaw's career, as riding or running became impossible. Knife wounds were common in gang conflicts. Deep stabs to the torso usually meant death within hours or days. Outlaws would stitch wounds using ordinary thread and needles, creating crude sutures that often failed. Internal bleeding claimed the lives of many men who initially appeared stable. Infections from minor cuts were surprisingly lethal. A small scratch could become infected, spread through the bloodstream, and lead to death within a week. Without antibiotics, outlaws succumbed to injuries that today would warrant only a bandage and some ointment. Dental problems were excruciating and widespread. Decayed teeth caused constant agony. Outlaws would extract their own teeth using pliers, frequently breaking the tooth and leaving infected roots that caused abscesses. Some outlaws became mentally unstable due to chronic tooth pain. The truly unfortunate contracted diseases. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various fevers killed outlaws who had survived multiple gunfights. Living in damp caves, consuming poor food, and enduring constant stress devastated immune systems. Many wanted men simply fell ill and died in their hideouts, never apprehended by the law. Nonetheless, staying ahead of the law, eluding posses and bounty hunters, demanded constant vigilance and skills that most outlaws lacked. The moment you engaged in a serious transgression, numerous factions were hot on your trail. Local sheriffs, U.S. Marshals, Pinkerton detectives, and independent bounty hunters all sought your capture, dead or alive. More often than not, a deceased outlaw presented a simpler and safer outcome for them. The most immediate peril came from pauses. Following a robbery, law enforcement would assemble armed groups and embark on a pursuit of outlaws within mere hours. These pause teams possessed intimate knowledge of the local terrain and excelled at tracking. Outlaws typically had a window of about 6 hours before skilled trackers were on their scent. The tracking capabilities of frontier lawmen were truly formidable. They could discern hoofprints on rocky surfaces, identify individual horses, and accurately forecast an outlaw's probable destination. Outlaws employed every conceivable ruse to shake off their pursuers, including riding through streams, backtracking, splitting up, or even leading horses backward to obscure the trail's direction. However, what most outlaws failed to grasp was that professional trackers remained unfooled by these stratagems. They had witnessed them all before. Leading your horse backward simply signaled to them that you were attempting to conceal your path, confirming their proximity. In fact, it inadvertently aided trackers by affirming they were on the correct trajectory. Pinkerton detectives represented the most formidable pursuers. These seasoned investigators infiltrated criminal networks, amassed intelligence, and orchestrated intricate operations. They commanded resources, exhibited unwavering patience, and operated without jurisdictional constraints. Pinkertons would relentlessly track outlaws for months, or even years, meticulously gathering information until the opportune moment to strike arrived. Bounty hunters were unpredictable and frequently more dangerous than conventional law enforcement. They disregarded legal protocols and were disinclined to take an outlaw alive if a dead one proved more expedient. Some bounty hunters were former outlaws themselves, intimately familiar with every trick of the trade. They would ambush hideouts, lay traps, and execute without prior warning. Wanted posters disseminated your image throughout the West. These descriptions were remarkably precise, detailing scars, tattoos, distinctive features, and known associates. Outlaws might attempt to alter their appearance by growing beards, cutting their hair, or even burning their fingertips. Nevertheless, inherent characteristics such as height, build, and mannerisms proved far more challenging to conceal. Telegraph lines facilitated the transmission of information at a pace exceeding that of horses. A robbery in one town would be relayed to neighboring areas within hours. Outlaws would arrive in a new settlement, believing themselves unknown, only to find lawmen awaiting them, forewarned by a telegraphic alert. The truly astute outlaws scrutinized lawmen as diligently as lawmen scrutinized them. They would ascertain which sheriffs were proficient and which were negligent. They would preemptively avoid territories patrolled by skilled trackers, and instead target communities with inexperienced law enforcement. However, this level of intelligence gathering necessitated connections and information networks that most outlaws lacked. Regarding information, maintaining any connection with family or loved ones was almost impossible and often perilous. Embracing an outlaw life meant forsaking everyone dear to you. Contacting relatives would invariably draw lawmen to their residences. Visiting loved ones frequently resulted in ambushes. Yet, the profound emotional burden of utter isolation often compelled many outlaws to undertake fatal risks. Lawmen consistently surveilled the families of known outlaws. They would stake out homes, intercept correspondence, and repeatedly question relatives. Any interaction with family provided law enforcement with precious leads. Numerous outlaws met their capture or demise because they could not resist the urge for one last visit to their mother or wife. Letters posed a significant danger. Outlaws would endeavor to transmit messages through intermediaries, employing codes and pseudonyms, but lawmen routinely intercepted mail. A single letter could betray your location, your intentions, or your contacts. Prudent outlaws never committed anything to writing. Some outlaws tried to sustain clandestine relationships, encountering loved ones in secluded spots. Yet these rendezvous demanded careful planning and communication, thereby establishing discernible patterns. Lawmen would discern these patterns and orchestrate ambushes. Many romantic reunions culminated in gunfire and apprehension. Children represented the most profound emotional hardship. Outlaws with offspring understood they would likely never witness their growth. Some would secretly observe from afar, seeing their children in town, but unable to approach. Others simply vanished, leaving their families to presume them deceased. The psychological repercussions were devastating. Outlaws frequently developed severe depression, intense anxiety, and occasionally suicidal tendencies. The pervasive isolation, relentless fear, and absence of normal human connection mentally shattered these individuals. Some outlaws surrendered precisely because they could no longer endure the solitude. Female outlaws encountered additional obstacles. Women like Belle Starr or Pearl Hart were uncommon and subjected to scrutiny from both sides of the law. They struggled to blend in as readily as men and were often betrayed by former paramours or associates. The most tragic instances involved outlaws who had established families before their descent into criminality. They would covertly observe as their children matured without them, as their wives remarried, and as their lives progressed in their absence. This emotional torment surpassed any physical hardship. Some outlaws attempted to anonymously provide funds to their families, but this frequently backfired. Lawmen would trace the money, or family members would face arrest for receiving illicit gains. Trying to aid your family often only intensified their suffering. Concerning finances, managing stolen loot without access to banks or secure storage meant most outlaws ultimately died penniless, despite successful robberies. One might assume successful outlaws would be affluent. They plundered banks, trains, and stagecoaches, seizing thousands of dollars. However, the reality was that most outlaws met their end with virtually nothing. Managing money while on the run was nearly insurmountable. The initial predicament was the division of spoils. A gang of 6 individuals robbing a bank of $6,000 meant each received $1,000. This appears substantial until one realizes the difficulty of spending it safely. Lavish purchases attracted unwanted scrutiny. Suddenly acquiring expensive items as an apparent vagrant aroused suspicion. Carrying substantial amounts of cash was hazardous. Other outlaws might murder you for it. Lawmen discovering money on your person served as proof of robbery, compelling outlaws to conceal their funds, often burying them in remote locations, with intentions of retrieval later. Most never had the opportunity. Buried loot frequently remained lost indefinitely. Outlaws would hide money, subsequently be killed or captured, and the location would perish with them. The West is purportedly replete with buried outlaw treasures that were never recovered. These were not vast hoards, but rather the life savings of desperate individuals who died before they could utilize them. Spending money necessitated venturing into towns, which exposed them to risk. Outlaws would dispatch trusted associates to make purchases, but these intermediaries often simply pilfered the money and absconded. Trust proved costly and typically misplaced. Banks were unequivocally not an option. Outlaws could not establish accounts or utilize financial services. All transactions were conducted in cash, which was bulky, cumbersome, and hard to conceal. Carrying one's entire fortune on one's person or horse rendered one a target. Inflation and shifts in currency could render stolen money worthless. Confederate currency after the Civil War became nothing more than paper. Outlaws who had stolen Confederate money found themselves destitute overnight. Even legitimate currency could be tracked if banks recorded serial numbers. The truly successful outlaws attempted to invest in legitimate enterprises through intermediaries. But these arrangements usually failed. Business partners would swindle them, or lawmen would confiscate assets upon discovering the source of the investment capital. Most outlaws squandered money as quickly as they stole it. Gambling, drinking, and prostitutes devoured their earnings. The outlaw lifestyle did not foster saving or planning. They lived for the present, as tomorrow might bring their demise. Regarding death, the demise of outlaws was brutal, abrupt, and seldom resembled the dramatic shootouts portrayed in films. Hollywood romanticizes the image of outlaws perishing in fiery gunfights, going down in a hail of bullets. The reality was considerably less glamorous. Most outlaws died in ways that were pathetic, agonizing, or simply foolish. Ambushes accounted for more outlaw deaths than fair fights. Lawmen would lie in wait, concealed, and shoot outlaws without warning. Billy the Kid was shot in the dark by Pat Garrett while unarmed. Jesse James was shot in the back while adjusting a picture. These were not heroic deaths. They were executions. Hanging was the official fate for apprehended outlaws, but frontier hangings were not the swift neck snap depicted in cinema. Frequently, the drop was miscalculated, and outlaws would slowly strangle, taking minutes to die while crowds observed. Some hangings were so ineptly performed that outlaws had to be hanged twice. Many outlaws simply vanished. They would ride off and never be seen again. Did they succumb to exposure? Were they murdered by their own gang? Did they plummet off a cliff in the darkness? No one knew. The West was littered with unmarked graves, containing outlaws who died alone and forgotten. Disease claimed many outlaws. Cholera, typhoid, and other illnesses swept through outlaw camps. Men who had survived multiple gunfights would eventually perish, delirious with fever, in a cave. This was hardly the glorious outlaw death they had envisioned. Accidents were surprisingly common. Outlaws would fall from horses, drown while crossing rivers, or die in campfire mishaps. One notorious outlaw died when his gun accidentally discharged as he cleaned it. Another fell off a cliff while intoxicated. These deaths were humiliating and pointless. Suicide claimed many outlaws. The ceaseless stress, isolation, and fear drove men to self-destruction rather than face capture or relentless flight. Some shot themselves when cornered by lawmen. Others simply surrendered to despair and ended their lives in their hideouts. Friendly fire regularly killed outlaws. In the chaos of robberies or gunfights, gang members would accidentally shoot each other. Poor visibility, panic, and a lack of training rendered outlaws as perilous to themselves as to their targets. The truly unfortunate ones were killed by civilians. Local citizens frequently formed vigilante groups, executing suspected criminals without formal proceedings. These mass killings were savage, often involving torture before death. Outlaws apprehended by such groups typically wished they had been caught by official law enforcement instead. Regarding violence, the actual robberies that brought outlaws their notoriety were far more disorderly and perilous than depicted in films. Bank heists were anything but smooth operations. They were frenzied, violent incidents where everything could go awry. Outlaws would storm in, firing weapons to terrify everyone before seizing cash. However, banks possessed unyielding safes, armed guards, and customers who occasionally resisted. Time was a critical adversary. Each passing second in a bank heightened the probability of lawmen arriving. Outlaws would yell at bank staff to expedite safe openings, but time-locked vaults were impenetrable even to employees. Many robberies failed because the criminals could not reach the main vault. Townspeople would begin firing from outside. Shop owners and armed residents would grab rifles and shoot at the bank. Outlaws would find themselves trapped indoors, pinned down by gunfire from multiple directions. Numerous bank robberies devolved into sieges, concluding with the death or capture of the outlaws. Horses would bolt. The din of gunfire would startle horses tethered outside. Outlaws would finish a robbery only to discover their escape mounts had vanished. They would be forced to flee on foot under fire, a situation that seldom ended favorably. Train robberies presented even greater dangers. Trains carried armed guards, and passengers were often armed themselves. Outlaws would halt trains by obstructing tracks or boarding at stations. Yet, once aboard, they confronted a multitude of potential threats within a confined space. Express car safes were almost impossible to open. Outlaws would attempt to blast them with dynamite, but they would either use too much, destroying the money, or too little, failing to open the safe. Many train robberies yielded minimal results because the outlaws could not access the primary cargo. Stagecoach robberies were the least hazardous, but also the least lucrative. Stagecoaches carried limited funds and valuables. Outlaws risked their lives for a mere few $100s, which would then be divided among several individuals. The risk-reward ratio was abysmal. During robberies, outlaws, fueled by adrenaline, made disastrous decisions. They would shoot needlessly, incurring murder charges that led to hanging instead of imprisonment. They would neglect to watch their backs and fall victim to individuals they had overlooked. Panic and inadequate planning thwarted more robbery attempts than robust security measures. The escape was the most perilous stage. Outlaws would flee with posses forming within minutes. They would be riding furiously, often unfamiliar with the terrain, making errors that led to their apprehension. Many successful robberies culminated in capture because the escape strategy failed. Regarding planning, the absence of any long-term foresight meant that even prosperous outlaws eventually met their downfall. Outlaws did not plan for the future because they anticipated no future. This short-sightedness guaranteed their eventual capture or demise. Each robbery intensified the pressure on them. Every crime added to their wanted poster. The burden only grew. Astute criminals would commit a few offenses, take the proceeds, and vanish to establish respectable lives elsewhere. However, outlaws continued their criminal activities because they knew no other way. The outlaw lifestyle was addictive. The adrenaline, the notoriety, the quick money, all kept them returning. Retirement was not an option. One could not simply cease being an outlaw. The crimes had no expiration date. Wanted posters remained active for decades. Former outlaws who attempted to reform were recognized and arrested years later. Once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. Some outlaws fantasized about escaping to Mexico or South America. A few, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, actually succeeded. But even in foreign lands, they could not outrun their past. They would persist in criminal acts due to lack of other skills, and ultimately meet a violent end in a foreign country. The accumulation of adversaries ensured an eventual death. Every robbery created individuals seeking vengeance. Every betrayed partner became a potential informant. Every lawman humiliated became fixated on their capture. The list of those wishing for their demise lengthened with each crime. Age was another neglected factor. Young outlaws in their 20s could ride strenuously, recover from injuries, and endure physical demands. Yet outlaws in their 30s and 40s could not maintain the same pace. Their bodies deteriorated from years of harsh living. Slower reflexes and declining health made them vulnerable targets. The evolving West diminished outlaw opportunities. As the frontier became civilized, fewer remote areas offered refuge. Telegraph and railroad networks complicated escapes. Improved law enforcement and Pinkerton agencies made crime more challenging. The outlaw era was concluding, and those who failed to adapt perished. Most outlaws never considered legitimate alternatives. With their proficiencies in riding, shooting, and survival, they could have served as ranch hands, scouts, or lawmen. However, the outlaw identity became intrinsically linked to who they were. They preferred to die as outlaws rather than live as ordinary citizens. Speaking of identity, the psychological toll of outlaw life ravaged men's minds long before bullets destroyed their bodies. The constant stress of outlaw life led to severe mental health issues that were neither understood nor treated. Outlaws developed what we now recognize as PTSD, anxiety disorders, and depression. Yet, in the 1800s, one was simply seen as mad or weak. Paranoia became overwhelming. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every nocturnal sound signaled an approaching posse. Outlaws would awaken screaming, draw weapons on their own gang members, and perceive non-existent dangers. This paranoia resulted in poor decisions and needless violence. Sleep deprivation exacerbated mental problems. Outlaws struggled to sleep properly due to fear and uncomfortable conditions. Chronic sleep loss induced hallucinations, impaired judgment, and emotional instability. Many outlaws made fatal errors simply because they were too exhausted to think clearly. Alcohol and drug abuse were rampant. Outlaws drank heavily to cope with stress and fear. Laudanum, a liquid opium mixture, was widely available and commonly consumed. These substances offered temporary relief, but worsened mental health and led to addiction. The loss of identity was psychologically devastating. Outlaws could not use their real names or discuss their past. They had to perpetually maintain false identities. This disconnection from their true selves caused profound psychological distress. Who were they truly? The person they once were, or the outlaw they had become? Guilt gnawed at many outlaws. Despite their tough exteriors, many felt remorse for those they had killed or injured. This guilt manifested as nightmares, depression, and self-destructive behavior. Some outlaws essentially committed suicide by taking increasingly reckless risks. The absence of purpose beyond sheer survival was existentially crushing. Outlaws built nothing and worked towards no goals. They merely ran and survived day by day. This meaningless existence drove some outlaws to madness. They would suffer a mental breakdown and either surrender or commit a suicidal act. Social isolation demolished mental health. Humans require connection and community. Outlaws possessed neither. They could not trust anyone, could not form genuine relationships, and lived in perpetual isolation, even when surrounded by gang members. This loneliness was psychologically unbearable. The truly tragic aspect was that many outlaws began as decent people who made poor choices. Perhaps they killed someone in self-defense or stole to feed their families. But once branded an outlaw, society offered no path to redemption. They were compelled to continue down a road that led solely to death or prison. So there you have it. The real outlaw life was not a romantic adventure, but a brutal existence filled with fear, betrayal, isolation, and premature death. Most did not choose that path. Circumstances, bad fortune, or one irreversible error propelled them into a life from which they could not escape. The Wild West was not wild because it was free.